I had a great and supportive husband, their father, and he was just terrific. And he took time off work and went part-time to be home and help look after the boys when they were little. And then as they got older, I was very lucky that as a state parliamentarian, I wasn't required to travel in the way that federal parliamentarians are. But we did have this very complicated system of every Sunday night, we filled out a chart in our house of every single day of the week, where each person in the family was going to be, what we were having for dinner that night, who was going to pick up, which kid from soccer training, and where mom and dad were going to be. And I really find that what that created was not just a bit of order over the chaos, but for my children, very much a sense of predictability, that they could look on the chart, which was up in their room and in the kitchen, and know at any time where mom or dad was, or if dad was home, when was mom coming home, and vice versa, and to have a sense of predictability in their week and in what otherwise to them would have looked like a very chaotic existence.
Kristina, you've also had, you've got two sons, but you've also faced a tragedy that many mothers would find unimaginable, a daughter who died at birth. What gave you the strength to put things back together?
Yeah, John, this was my daughter Caroline. She is between my two boys, and she was stillborn. And stillbirth is a tragedy that affects 6 Australian families every single day. And my daughter was born 20 years ago, and the rate of stillbirth in Australia hasn't changed in that entire time. I think a lot of people will know somebody who's had in their family or friends who've had a stillborn baby, but I think when we talk about pregnancy care and expecting a baby, we haven't really done a very good job of talking to parents about how they can reduce the risk of stillbirth. For me personally, when it happened, it was, I have to say, I was very angry, and particularly angry at God. I had a real sense of peace that my daughter was with God, and therefore was in a place that was filled with grace and love. But I was very angry that she wasn't with me. She wasn't with her parents, and I didn't understand how a loving God could take a child away from its mother. And in the midst of all this, and I'm a Christian, and in my Christian tradition, of course, we believe that God is neither male nor female, though God is most often depicted as male, as father. But in the Christian tradition, God is neither male nor female. And it struck me at one point during, in fact, during the Easter week, Lent celebrations and commemorations, that, if I believe that God is neither male nor female, and God's child, Jesus, died, God is a mother whose child has died. And to think about the fact that God knows the sorrow of a parent who has lost a child, because God is a parent whose child died. And that doesn't make, it doesn't make it instantly easy, but it means that God's grace and love understands the depth of the human suffering that I and every other parent who has had this tragedy occur. God you can enter into that and share that with God, because God's understanding of the human condition can put God's love and grace around that. And it also said to me, God doesn't directly intervene in our lives and make choices, that this family is going to get to keep this baby and this one isn't. That's not how, I don't believe God works in those ways. It's not about blaming God. It's about realizing that God has created this human creation, and sometimes God doesn't control it, and nor do we always. But we can only control what happens afterwards. And in that afterwards, it was that understanding that God's love and mercy was understood, the depths of the pain and the suffering. That really was a moment where I felt like I might be able to recover from this.
I'd like to pick up a couple of those themes before we end this conversation, but let's just go to the immediate for a moment. The speech you gave last week on immigration in the time of COVID has raised a few eyebrows, even among Labor ranks. Some saw its tone as a dog whistle to the blue-collar conservatives who feel progressive politics has left them behind. What's your response?
John, I'm so glad you asked about this. First of all, it was an opinion piece. It wasn't a speech, and I would encourage people to read it rather than some of the media headlines and debate that followed it. Because if you read the piece, I say quite specifically, Australia is the most successful multicultural nation on earth. I talk about the fact that we are a nation built by migrants, and particularly by permanent migrants. You think of all of the waves of migration that have come here, people who have, contributed to building up communities, businesses, faith communities, local communities, schools. Yeah, and that gift of migration is one of Australia's great achievements. I myself am a migrant. The things that I talk about in this piece is how our migration intake is shifting. We are a nation that's been built by permanent migration, by permanent migrants. We are shifting increasingly towards a nation that has got a rising number of temporary workers. And, I don't think any of us really want to see Australia become a guest worker nation where we have people come here for a temporary period of time as second class, not citizens, as a second class of worker who are paid less, who are open to exploitation. And that model of, and that is what's happening though. I mean, I have done significant consultations in regional and urban areas with employers and with unions. And, the real risk of, the type of exploitation and wage theft that we see in, say, the 7-Eleven case, that's starting to cement itself as an economic model across Australia. And so what I'm calling for us is us to think about during this time while migration is effectively stopped because of COVID, when we restart that program, what do we want it to look like? I think, and I would advocate that we should have a program that does seek to bring in people here permanently, people who can contribute long term. And want to contribute long term and have a stake in the future of the country. And so that's what that piece sought to make a call for, and particularly to think about how we use in the short term while the borders are closed, how we use the opportunity to provide skills and training to Australians to fill the labour market gaps that are going to occur when the domestic economy reopens, but the borders remain closed. If we're not having people come in to work in both skilled and unskilled jobs, we are going to need Australians to fill those jobs. And we need to be thinking now about how we provide the skills and training to fill those coming labour market gaps.
Mujgan.
This is in relation to racism in Australia, and in this COVID-19 we saw a little bit of it towards the Chinese. What do you say to the Chinese during the COVID-19 pandemic period, and also against to Muslims from time to time when racism was against the Muslims? How are we to deal with all of this when we go out into society again and when the social distancing is over? Now, how do we deal with all of this? What would you say to the Chinese or to Muslims or any other race that racism is against, I suppose? Yes.
It's a great question, Mujgan, and I think we're all right now realizing how important it is here in Australia during COVID-19 that we are all in this together, that we are all part of the same team. We do come, as that beautiful song says, from all the lands on earth, but we are all Australian. And Andrew Giles, our my assistant minister, my colleague for immigration and citizenship, we have been spearheading an effort to one, make clear that that is our message as the Australian Labor Party, and two, to call for an anti-racism campaign. It has been almost a decade now since Australia had its last national anti-racism campaign, and this is a time where I think there is a real risk, and we are seeing it overseas, and we are, and I understand, that this is an issue that can well percolate and here in Australia, the rise of right-wing extremism. It's something that my colleague Anna Lee, Ed Husick, me, Andrew, and a few of my other colleagues are working on how we show some leadership in the Australian community to one, send that message that we are all in this together. Two, to make sure that we have policy settings in place, including an anti-racism campaign, and approaches to disrupt that right-wing extremist narrative and propagandizing and recruiting. And three, ultimately look to, as we come out of this, being able to take what we've learned. I mean, the opportunities, when I was a premier, I used to do things in person with Affinity. To be able to do it now here from my office here in Parliament House on Zoom is fantastic. And I don't know why we can't continue that type of approach after the social distancing eases. It's important to be together in person, and I look forward to that. But I think also to recognize there are many ways we can come together as a community.
Kristina, at the moment, there are Turkish mothers and children in the refugee. There are Australian mothers and children in the refugee camps on the Turkish and Syrian border. They've been through winter and now face COVID. Despite the challenges, some other countries have been extracting their citizens. Is the Australian government doing enough to bring them home? Mothers and children who have had no role in whatever horrors they've seen. What should Labor do? What would Labor do?
Well, a Labor government would, first of all, take the advice of security agencies. And, I think it's important to recognize that, right now the government is taking that advice. We don't have the full access to it. And so I can't say for certain what the government should or shouldn't do. But I can reflect on a few key propositions. One, I agree with the Prime Minister when he says that the children who are in our hall are there, they're the innocent victims. They are there through no fault of their own. And this has been a terrible start to their lives that no Australian child or any child should have to endure. I also note that while the government has said publicly that some of the women may pose a national security risk, that not all of them do. And some of the women who are there were children when they were taken, or they went as adults under perhaps false premises might be the way to put it, is the advice that we have, that some of them, the women themselves are also victims. The third thing I would observe is that if there are people there who are a national security risk, the government does have tools in place provided on a bipartisan basis by the Australian Labor Party support to manage people who do pose a national security risk, including the ability to arrest those people and to put them on trial under new offences that have been created, and then other new measures such as control orders and continuing detention orders. You are correct, John, that there are other countries, including our allies, the United States, who have encouraged Australia to repatriate its citizens. The government has chosen not to do that. As I said, without the opportunity to have the full security briefings that they have, I can't make any further comment than that. But I hope that people understand from the observations I've made that I share deeply the concerns, particularly for those children and those women who were taken there as minors, who are now mothers themselves. And I have met with some of the family members here in Australia of those women and children. I know that the Department of Home Affairs meets with them as well, and I think my heart goes out, particularly on Mother's Day, to those families who I know are only concerned about the well-being and the safety of their family members.
Mm. As you indicated earlier in your discussion about your own sort of thinking through the issues surrounding your children, religion continues to be a major force in much of the world, both at a personal and a societal level. And despite what may be seen in Australia from time to time, it's often, though, associated these days with ultra-conservative and even nationalist forces, be it in Christianity, say in Catholic Poland, or evangelicals in the United States, but in Islam, Judaism, even Buddhism in Myanmar and Hinduism in India. So as a progressive, what sustains your faith? I mean, how is it linked to your politics?
Yeah. It's a good question because I think sometimes you're right. People do draw some kind of automatic line between being a person of faith and being a conservative person. I have to say, having been raised a Catholic and being raised a Catholic in the social justice tradition of the Catholic Church, I am very much attracted to the political message that I believe is there in the gospel. I mean, you think about the gospel and the gospel teachings of Jesus. It is all about alleviating poverty, inclusivity, caring for the most vulnerable. The parables of the Good Samaritan, the woman at the well. These are all parables where Jesus puts himself on the side of the marginalized, the oppressed, and the outcast, those who are suffering in an unjust system. And often Jesus challenged the rulers of his time, both religious, and the religious rulers of his time were often the political rulers of his time too. But he challenged that ruling class, and you think about Jesus turning over the tables in the temple, taking up his ire against the money lenders. He at times was driven to a very passionate form of protest to make his point. That message spoke to me very powerfully as a young person. It continues to inspire me, and particularly in my tradition as a feminist, I am particularly drawn to the significant role that women play in the Gospels. Jesus first appeared to two women after he rose from the dead. His mother Mary plays a significant role in his ministry, in his development, and in his teachings. His first miracle was performed while his mother Mary was speaking to him at the wedding at Cana. So the importance of women within that tradition, even though it's a patriarchal tradition and at times women are unnamed and don't have the power and the influence I would like them to have at times in my own tradition, I do find the message that in that gospel it still motivates my faith and my political activity.
Mujgan.
In an increasingly multi-faith society, in our Australian society, how are we to deal with religious differences? Christian lens, for instance.
Yeah.
How important are interfaith activities such as the interfaith iftar meals that results in building community?
Yeah, look, I think they're so important. One of the things that my mother-in-law does at our local parish is help organize an interfaith Stations of the Cross, and I know she's more than just Christian traditions participate in that. And this year it was quite sad for her that didn't occur due to the COVID-19 restrictions. I participated in the iftar dinners, and I think it's a great moment for that cross understanding of how much we share, as Abrahamic faiths, and how much we share as Australians in the ways that our faith propels us. And then the last thing I'll just observe is that my colleague Ed Husick and I often share stories about how we're going with our various fasting or challenges in fasting, both in Ramadan and during Lent.
Thank you.
Kristina, Keneally, thank you so much for joining us. Ramadan Mubarak.
Thank you, you too. Thank you, Mujgan.
Well, Mujgan, our next guest tonight is Tasnim Chopra. She's an Order of Australia, a curator at the Immigration Museum Victoria for the Faith Fashion Fusion exhibition, but additionally, as an independent cross-cultural consultant, Tasneem delivers workshops on diversity for audiences ranging from Supreme Court judges to school students. The Australian magazine hailed Tasneem as one of the 100 emerging leaders of 2009 for her expertise in cross-cultural training. She's also chairperson of the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights. Tasneem, welcome to this Ramadan conversation.
Thank you, John, and Assalamu alaikum Mujgan. Lovely to be here.
Thank you, Salam, and happy Mother's Day to you too on this.
Thank you. Thank you. This is not how I'd planned spending it, but I'm delighted to.
Tasneem, we're halfway through Ramadan, as you know. How has your experiences been this year of a very different Ramadan, I think, for everyone, but how is your experiences?
I think there's a lot more time for forced introspection, if I can say that. We just have so much more time than we did in the past. Traditionally with Ramadan, with iftar being between 5 and 5:30, as it has been for the last over a decade, it's always a rush to get home from work if you've been working that day and prepare a meal and then sit down and then, spend time with the family because of the heated rush. This year it's very different. You're actually home for the entire time. You have time to prepare the meal. You have dinner at the set time without it looking like a last 5 minutes of a MasterChef episode of pots flying and screaming and, instructions and watching the clock. So there's none of that. There's a lot of calm, and I think with that calm comes space to contemplate the things that we know we're supposed to, but we never really did.
Tasneem, you've an extraordinary portfolio of interests. You received an OAM for your work on leadership, diversity and discrimination. You were appointed an anti-racism champion, also to the board of directors of Ambulance Victoria. So where does motherhood fit into the picture? I mean, how have you managed to be so successful in your career and also hold your personal life together?
Well, they didn't all happen at once, John. I had managed to have 3 kids probably before things really took off and there was a groundswell. But, you plan your time, and I think most women and mothers certainly can attest to the skill of multitasking. It's something that we've honed really well, and with years it gets easier. As the kids get older, they sort of look after themselves, and my kids are certainly young adults now, so they enable me to do what I need to do and support me in ways that 10 years ago was inconceivable.
What are some of your suggestions for those young women who are commencing their career and also looking forward to starting a family, Tasneem?
To be kind to yourself, and this whole notion of having it all, I think, is something that has been sold to us perhaps by a tabloid industry. I don't think having it all is the goal. I think having the things that we have and having them earnestly and well is the goal. So enjoy your time with your children. Enjoy work opportunities when they arise. If you don't get all the opportunities now, they do come up later. I know there's a sense, and I certainly had this idea, that you had to say yes to any opportunity that came up to you. But in fact, the opportunities will come even if you bypass them now. So prioritize self-care. I think the capacity to burn out is something we underestimate, And having been there and having burnt out, because as John mentioned, there was quite a few things on my plate at certain times, sometimes more than others, and the ability to learn to say no. I think there's often an expectation when you are the different person in the room who has come from a different background, who presents different ideas and perspectives to an organisation or to a product. There's a sense that you have an obligation to make sure that you're there to get things done, and that you must say yes to every opportunity or suggestion that's thrown your way. But I think that's a catch-22, because when you say yes to everything, you get everything thrown at you as well. So you learn to manage and learn to say no, because when you learn to say no, then other people learn to step up.
Well, let's talk about one of your interests for the moment. You're on the board of Lentil as Anything. Now, tell us something of its work and why you're involved.
Okay, well, that's actually slightly out of date. I was the chair of Lentil as Anything for about 3.5 years. I'm no longer the chair, but what drew me to that was their ethic of social justice. So underpinning the ethos of Lentil as Anything is the idea that everybody deserves a seat at the table, and your financial status should not dictate your access to healthy, nutritious food. So simply based on that premise, the Lentil as Anything franchise has grown from 1 to now 5 restaurants operating in Australia and 1 overseas. I believe the one in Italy, well, maybe not right now, but until recently was operating. So the idea that food is vegetarian means it's actually vegan now, means it's accessible to everybody. Nobody is excluded from eating vegan. They can eat, they can not eat out of choice because they prefer meat, yes, but it's not as if they can't eat vegan. So the food is inclusive, the food is developed and prepared by expert chefs, trained kitchen staff, and you don't have to pay for the food anything more than what you feel it's worth. So the idea that you get to choose how much the food is worth, when it first came about, I remember the founder of Lentil, Shanika Fernando, his father was like, oh my gosh, you're going to go broke before you even start. What kind of a harebrained idea is this? How do you not price food? It's, this is the 20th century or the 21st century. But he believed, Shanika firmly believed, and to this day he still does, that the moral compass of people will compel them to do the right thing. And it worked. And it's flourished from 1 restaurant to 5 simply on the premise that people believe not only that they'll give money for the food for what they think it's worth, but more often than not, they will actually pay forward for the cost of a meal for someone who can't. And that's the interesting thing about Lentil, is because it is accessible, because there are no prices, it does attract a lot of people who can't afford to eat. So you do get a set number of homeless people, a set number of people who very low socioeconomic background. I imagine right now it could be even higher. But to compensate for that, you get your yuppie market and your progressive millennial market who come in cashed up, believing in this cause and paying it forward. And so it's a beautiful example of society looking after itself.
Do you think that most of us are aware of the extraordinary work of multicultural and multi-faith groups in going beyond their brief to provide support to those most hurt in society? And I'm thinking particularly now of COVID, the support for essential workers, marginalised people, that most of us just drift along unaware of those things.
I think it's one of those things when you're in your bubble and you are frequenting the same particular community and same particular neighbourhood, and you know it really well. If that neighbourhood happens to be of a multicultural vein, then yes, your experience and your understanding is nuanced and you have a balance. If you live outside that bubble, perhaps in a more outer suburban, more inward or insular community, and you don't have that example, your only knowledge base then becomes what media is. And quite often the media, depictions of certain minority communities is less than favourable. And so that is a struggle. So long story short, there is tremendous work being undertaken by multicultural and multi-faith communities at a time like this even, where we know that the Sikh community, for example, have been providing free meals to families in parts of Australia now through their temples. We know that certainly in the Muslim community, I know, of course, there are Christian charities as well who are stepping up to the mark, providing hampers, distributing food, going above and beyond, setting up specific relief funds for women escaping, family violence situations as well. So communities are stepping up across the board and across the cultural divide. We don't always hear about it unless we're part of that fabric. I don't believe mainstream media has really captured that yet. I'm hopeful that they will. I think they need to sort of work on their PR angle a little bit more, but certainly it's out there. And when I get an opportunity to share it, that's what I want to do.
Mujgan.
How important is the interfaith outreach provided by groups like Affinity in building a genuinely multicultural society here in Australia, do you think?
No, I think Affinity plays a very pivotal role. It's got, it's done the hard yards, it's got the street cred, people know their name, they know their brand. It's certainly not about pushing a particular agenda. To me, my experience has really been bringing people to the table to have very genuine conversations and providing a safe platform for that. So I think more often than not, when we do hear about interfaith dialogues, they could often be skirmishes as opposed to conversations. And I think with Affinity, there's a certain caliber to what they bring, which is people who are skilled, people who are experienced at conversation, who are open-minded, and who are there to actually listen and talk to you, not at you. I think it's a very, very important distinction to be made there. So you feel that you're not being preached to, you feel that you're being spoken to. And you can actually ask challenging questions. You can shift your thought in a safe way without feeling threatened. And I think, credit where it's due to Affinity for facilitating that environment.
Tasneem, it's been great for you to give us your time tonight. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. It could have gone much longer, but thanks so much for your time this evening.
My pleasure. Thanks, John. Assalamu alaikum, Michigan.
So, Mujgan, it's time to turn to our final guest. Joining us tonight, Emma Alberici. Emma is the ABC's chief economics correspondent and one of Australia's most highly regarded journalists. Her career began at News Limited's Herald Sun newspaper in Melbourne. Emma worked for the Nine Network for 10 years before joining the ABC, where she served as both European correspondent during the economic crash of 2008-2009, and later for 6 years as host of Lateline. Outside of work, Emma Alberici has been active with the charity Camp Quality for over 20 years, since she became the companion of two very special brothers. She's also the mother of 3 children of her own. Emma, welcome to this Ramadan conversation.
John, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
You've maintained an extraordinarily demanding schedule as a journalist, yet you've managed a rich personal life with 3 children of your own and an active commitment to others through things like Camp Quality. Where does it come from? What sustains you?
Oh, it's a big question. I think that it probably stems from the fact that my parents were migrants back in post-war era Australia in 1955, having met on the boat coming to Australia from Italy, from different parts of Italy, one from the north and one from the south. And I know the struggles they went through in the beginning of their life trying to integrate here and trying to make their own way in this new world. And I certainly know the struggles. And I guess, I can only reflect on this as an adult, and as an adult of, having become a parent and so on. I guess I know where it came from at the start, but I guess now I can look back and say, well, I knew how hard my parents had it, but of course they gave me every opportunity such that I didn't have it tough at all. And my children certainly have no idea what it means to struggle. And I guess that has given me a lens through which to see the world that makes me understand how lucky I am. Perhaps that's where it's rooted in.
Mujgan.
At a practical level, how have you balanced those competing priorities in your life? No.
Mujgan, it's very lovely to be here with you also tonight. Happy
Thank you.
Mother's
And
Day to
happy
you.
Mother's Day to you too as well. We
Balancing
forget
it. We do. Look, balancing it, honestly, I don't know that I do balance it, to be I think they fall down a lot, and I think talk about that enough, that even though on the outside it looks like we've got it all together, I certainly can never say that I have. Certainly not. I don't have it all together all of the time. I have bits of it together. Let's put it that way. And maybe if people think otherwise, that's their perception, not my reality. I told a very funny story. Well, I got asked to do an event at the Giant Dwarf Theatre, which used to be run by the guys who did the Chaser comedy act, and by two good friends of mine, Rebecca Huntley and Sarah McDonald. And it was called, you might have heard of it, The Full Catastrophe. And they asked me to talk about a time in my life when things were so bad they were funny. And I've never done comedy before, and I was very out of my comfort zone. But the first thing that came to my mind was when I became the ABC's first or second foreign correspondent in its 86-year history as a mother. And I had 3 children under 3. So not only was I the first mother foreign correspondent, I had 3 children under 3. Because, you know, nothing like doing things the whole hog. And when I say that out loud, even to myself, I think, what kind of crazy was I? And when I say that to other people, of course, that's the first thing that comes into their head. And I think that all I can say is that it's really hard, but when you're passionate about something, and not only your work, I'm just very lucky. I think I've lived that adage about when you love your job, you don't work a day in your life. I've been really, really lucky in that respect. And I love telling stories to the world. I love telling stories about injustice. I love, whether that's politics or business. Obviously, for most of my career, 30-year career, it's mostly been business and economics, sort of overlaid with politics and international affairs, which has given me a really rich tapestry from which to create my stories. And having come from a migrant story of my own, and I have to say also, in terms of drawing in our conversation tonight around Ramadan and the celebration of all faiths, but in this context, the Muslim faith, as I saw throughout my most recent 18 years with the ABC and 10 years with Channel 9 before that, and 4 years with News Limited before that, but most recently, the last 20 years of my career, most of which has been at the ABC, has been around the arrival of for those who have that historical reference point, the arrival of the Tampa, the 2001 election, and from there on in, the kind of, I guess, in some regards, the demonisation of the Muslim community and the rise of Islamophobia. It made me remember what it was like as a child, being the child of a migrant Italian family where we were wogs and we were the other. And I knew what it felt like to be the other. And now suddenly, because everyone loves spaghetti bolognese and pizza, and you know, we're suddenly extremely, integrated. We've been appropriated, like today someone said on Twitter, was chicken parma the Australian national dish? And I said, how dare you? That's cultural appropriation. So how far we've come, right? And unless you've got that historical context as a journalist, I think that you can't necessarily tell stories in the full 360.
You've maintained, as you indicated, strong links with, you've maintained very strong links with your Italian heritage, Emma. You spent some time in Italy last year before the COVID crisis erupted. We're now looking at staggering death rates in Italy, in the United Kingdom, and the USA. And in the case of the USA and the UK, it's also being used to stir nationalist and xenophobic sentiments. And it's also talked about in a way where life and death issues have to be weighed in some sort of economic balance. are deployed.
Oh, I'm going to swap my headphones because I can't hear you very well. So just give me 1 second.
Okay.
I think the
Okay.
internet.
Do you want me to? You want me to repeat some of that?
Yes, if you don't mind. Yes, please.
No, that's all right. You've maintained strong links with your Italian heritage. You've spent some time in Italy last year before the COVID-19 crisis. Now looking at the staggering rate in Italy, the United Kingdom, and the United States. In the case of the US, it's talked about in issues are talked about in economic terms, as if they have to be weighed in an economic. What's your assessment of the way arguments are being deployed?
Life and death issues, Emma, have to be weighed in the economic balance. What's your assessment of the way those arguments are being used?
I lost a bit of that, but hopefully I've got you back now. I think it's very instructive to let you know that I'm currently working on, and it hasn't been promoted yet, but it will be on Tuesday, a foreign correspondent about the way the lockdown has affected the very poor of India. And that has become not a health emergency as much as a humanitarian emergency. And so in Italy, yes, of course, we've had the most astonishing situation play out. My own uncle died of COVID-19 in a nursing home in Milan only 2 weeks ago. He was 76 and he'd only been in the nursing home for 2 weeks. And so it was particularly heartbreaking for my cousins because they'd made the wrenching decision to put him in a nursing home. Their mother died when she was only 49, so some 30 years ago, of breast cancer, and he'd been dying slowly for the last 30 years of a broken heart, and then to have him be put in a nursing home and then die such a lonely death was, something I've had to sort of live through with them over the last few weeks in parallel to all of the horrors internationally that we've been going through. And all the talk about the economic damage really seems to pale when you look at the human toll. But in India, when they shut down with just 4 hours notice, the Modi government told everyone at 8 o'clock at night on the 24th of March that they would be shutting down in a very unilaterally kind of, draconian manner at midnight. That meant migrant workers who'd come from all over the country to work in the big capitals of Delhi and Mumbai and Hyderabad and so on were forced to stay in their slums where they wanted to be in their villages with their families. And so there, as you would have seen the pictures on the news, hordes of people walking the highways to get home to their villages, starving some of them along the way, committing suicide some of them because they couldn't face their families without any more income to support them, to feed them. And almost 1 in 4 people in India is already below the poverty line pre-COVID. The fact that you're confining people to slums where they have no access to money or food or water in some cases has been quite traumatic and devastating to watch unfold. Obviously, doing my job as a foreign correspondent from my living room has been particularly trying, but we've certainly seen the effects.
Mujgan.
Been an active supporter of Camp Quality and have been a great volunteer. That's what it does and what prompted your involvement. How has that involvement changed your perspective on life, personally and professionally?
It's been an incredible experience for me that started in 1999 when I was on Channel 9's A Current Affair, and I was asked to go and do a story about Lend a Hand Week, which was, I don't know if it's still operates, it was a charitable week where people would do things for someone else and the money raised would go to their charity of choice. And it was the Army Barracks in Paddington, Sydney, that was being cleaned up, and the money was going to Camp Quality. So Camp Quality was there for the day, and I was interviewing children and the CEO of Camp Quality, and just doing a very simple little sweet story about this money being. And while I was there, I was sitting with the CEO after I'd interviewed the kids, and he said, "Oh, I really liked the way you speak kids, Emma. Would you think about being a companion?" And I was a 29-year-old, certainly didn't have any kids of my own yet. And I didn't know what that was all about. I spent a weekend with them. They took it all obviously very seriously, because you're taking, now I understand and appreciate the enormity of it, having my own children, that I was being given a 4-year-old for a week to look after on my own. When I think about it now, crazy Penny and Gary, who are still among my closest friends, the parents of Tom, who is now 20, and the fact they gave him to me when he was 4 is still astonishing. I wouldn't have given anyone to me at any age at 29, but anyway, that's another story. And so I learned a lot about resilience. I learned a lot about, Penny and Gary were both very senior police in New South Wales, mum and dad of Tom and Jake, 2 sons who were tragically both afflicted with the same life-threatening disease. It was a genetic disease that was so unknown in Australia, continues to be so unknown internationally, that at the time they were only 2 of 4 kids in the entire country who had this condition. Their son, who is the oldest son, Jake, is now 27. Is the oldest survivor in the world of this particular condition. If anyone's seen that movie Lorenzo's Oil, it's a similar condition to that. And it's called MLD, metachromatic leukodystrophy, and it attacks different parts of your body until you have no capacities left. And so he's sort of in a vegetative state, but he has his cognitive abilities such that he can express himself in some regard, but not very well. And for everything else, he's sort of, needs 100% care. But his parents have maintained their incredible positivity through all of this. In fact, Penny, their mother, I would say is one of the most positive people I've ever known in my life. And she has 2 of 3 children who have life-threatening terminal illnesses. And she's the kind of person everyone leans on for support. And you'll be there, pouring your heart out to her about all your woes, and then you'll have to stop yourself and go, hold on, that's right, you've got 2 terminally ill children you've been battling with for 20 years. And I have to check myself and remember that this incredibly positive, bright woman in my life and the most amazing mother is also going through something none of us could ever imagine. And she's strong. And she also looked after her father until he died last year, even though she had 2 other siblings. So some people in the world, they say that God gives people, what they can bear. And I think with her, maybe it was a bit too much. But she's carried it in a way that is astonishing to me every day. And that's, it's a test, and it's about perspective. It's about not losing perspective and not losing the ability to, thank whoever you thank, and be thankful for everything that's great in our world. And there is so much that's so great.
Emma, thank you so much for sharing so generously tonight with those conversations. It gives real meaning to the sorts of things that we've been seeking to achieve with these Ramadan Conversations. Thank you for joining this roundtable iftar.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you very much, Mujgan. I've really enjoyed it.
And
happy Mother's Day to everyone.
Happy Mother's Day to you as well, too. And John.
Well, Mujgan, that's just about all we have time for in today's program. Thanks for being part of the team this evening. Look forward to catching up again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you, John.
And thank you all at home or wherever you happen to be for joining us on this Ramadan conversation. Our next episode will be tomorrow, and we'll travel to Adelaide to converse with some more distinguished guests. Over the past week, our conversations have featured a number of well-known if you or any of this series of Ramadan Conversation, you can find them on the Affinity YouTube channel. Stay safe. Have a blessed Ramadan.